The monitor had been flatlining for 4 seconds when Nurse Hazel Drummond pressed her hands into the man's sternum for the 11th time, and she was counting because counting was the only thing keeping her in her body. Bay 3 of the Greystone Regional Emergency Department smelled like antiseptic, and the particular kind of fear that doesn't have a name. The one that comes when a body is deciding whether to stay or go. The patient, male mid-50s, no ID, had come in by ambulance at 6:47 in the morning. Blunt chest trauma. Possible internal bleed. His color was wrong and his pressure was dropping, and Hazel had been on her feet since the previous evening, and none of that mattered at all, because his heart had stopped 7 minutes ago and she was not going to let that be the end of it. 12. 13. The doors at the far end of the corridor opened. She didn't look up. She heard them before she saw them, the particular acoustics of a group of people in good shoes, walking on hospital floors, the kind of deliberate, unhurried pace that belongs to people who have never had to run toward anything. 14. Nurse. The voice came from behind her left shoulder. She registered it the way she registered most things in a resuscitation, as data, assigned a priority filed accordingly. Low priority. She kept her hands moving. Nurse, I need you to pause for a moment. Hazel looked at the monitor. She looked at her hands. She did not stop. The man who had spoken stepped into her peripheral vision. She knew who he was without looking directly at him. Administrator Clifton Barr, Regional Director of Operations for Greystone Health Network. A man she had encountered in 3 previous all-staff meetings and 0 emergencies. He was wearing the same suit he always wore, charcoal gray with a thin chalk stripe, and he was standing close enough that she could smell his aftershave, something expensive and completely out of place. We have guests in the building, Barr said. From Ottawa, the review committee. I need the bay cleared. 15. 16. His rhythm hasn't returned, Hazel said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. I understand that. I'm asking you to transfer care and move him to Bay 7. Bay 7 doesn't have a crash cart. That's a logistics issue we can address. She stopped. Not because she agreed with him. She stopped because her brain needed 1 second, just one, to confirm that she had heard him correctly. She lifted her face and looked at Clifton Barr directly for the first time, and what she saw was not cruelty or panic or even embarrassment. He was calm. He was making a resource allocation decision. He was looking at the glass panel on the far wall of the corridor, where 4 people in lanyards stood with clipboards, waiting. Move him, Barr said, and we can continue this conversation. Hazel turned back to the patient. She resumed compressions. She heard Barr exhale. She heard him say behind her to someone she couldn't see, "Can someone else take over here?" It wasn't a question, doctor. Samard appeared at her side, young, 2 years out of residency, the kind of doctor who had not yet learned when to say no to administrative pressure because the cost of learning that lesson has always been too high. He looked at Hazel, he looked at Barr, he looked at the patient. Hazel, he said, quietly. Don't, she said, just the one word. Samard took a step back. 17, 18. The defibrillator had been charged. She called for a shock. The team moved around her with the specific efficiency of people who have done this together many times, and for 30 seconds Clifton Barr and his review committee and all the politics of Greystone Regional simply did not exist. The patient's heart restarted at 7:22 a.m. It was a sinus rhythm, weak but real. Hazel stood with her hands at her sides and let the feeling move through her the way it always did. The particular relief that isn't happiness exactly, more like the absence of a weight that you had stopped noticing was there. Then she turned around. Barr was still in the doorway. The committee members had dispersed somewhat, trying to look like they had been elsewhere. One of them was making notes on a clipboard. He's stable, Hazel said. Barr nodded. Good. Then you can move him now. She pulled off one of her gloves, then the other. I'm not moving him, Hazel. He used her first name the way people use first names when they want to signal that they are being patient with you. We have been planning this site review for 4 months. The committee is evaluating our emergency infrastructure for the purposes of provincial funding allocation. The state of Bay 3 right now does not reflect what we have built here. Bay 3 right now is working exactly the way it's supposed to. That's a subjective assessment. She looked at him. A man came in without a heartbeat and left with one. I'm not sure what you would need to see to call that a success. Barr's jaw shifted. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read. Not anger, precisely, more like recalibration. He looked at the committee members. He looked back at her. You're relieved for the rest of the shift, he said. Go home, Hazel. We'll talk Monday. She walked to the nursing station and wrote up her notes. She was thorough. She dated everything and timed everything, and she wrote down Barr's exact words as best she could remember them because she had been a nurse for 11 years. And she knew that documentation was not a formality. It was armor. She drove home in the February cold with the defroster running on high and the radio off. The highway between Greystone and her apartment in the east end of the city was empty at that hour, just the flat gray of the Canadian shield on either side, and the pale early light starting to come up over the tree line. She thought about the patient in Bay 3. She thought about the rhythm on the monitor. She thought about Clifton Bear's aftershave and the way he had looked at the committee members through the glass. She did not think about what came next. That came later when she was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she'd forgotten to drink, watching it go cold. Her phone showed Monday, then Tuesday, then Wednesday. By Thursday, Greystone's HR department had sent a formal letter of suspension citing conduct unbecoming and failure to follow administrative direction during a scheduled site evaluation. The letter used a great many words and said very few things. She read it twice and then set it face down on the table. She called her union rep, a man named Kowalski, first name Graham, voice like gravel, 30 years in healthcare labor, and not a single sentence wasted, who listened to everything she said without interrupting and then asked her to send him the documentation. She sent him the documentation. She didn't hear from the hospital after that. Not officially. Unofficially, she got a text from one of the other nurses in the department. Just, Bear told the committee the bay was being upgraded. Showed them the unit before yours. You didn't exist. She sat with that for a while. She went back to her notes. She added a detail she'd almost forgotten. That one of the men in the committee group had been wearing a military service lapel pin, the kind that members of the Canadian Armed Forces Liaison Division wear at civic events. Small, rectangular. The red and white were unmistakable. She did not know yet why that detail mattered. She found out 10 days later. His name was Colonel Wallace Fortin, and he was the regional liaison officer for the Department of National Defense's Health Infrastructure portfolio, which meant, among other things, that he was responsible for assessing civilian hospital networks that held memoranda of understanding with Canadian forces. Greystone Regional held one such memorandum. It had been renewed the previous autumn. It was worth, according to the documents Hazel eventually obtained under the Provincial Freedom Information Act, approximately $3.2 million annually in federal coordination funding. The review committee had not been there for the provincial allocation. They had been there for the federal one, and the patient in Bay 3, the man with no ID who had arrived by ambulance at 6:47 in the morning with blunt chest trauma and no heartbeat. His name was Sergeant Major Darnell Obi, retired, a 22-year veteran of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, who had been in a single vehicle accident on Highway 17 the previous night, and whose service number was still on file with Veterans Affairs. Hazel had not known any of that when she pressed her hands into his chest for the 11th time. She had known that his color was wrong and his pressure was dropping, and that his heart had stopped. That had been enough. Graham Kowalski called her on a Thursday morning, and his voice was different from the previous calls. Not gravel so much as stone, the kind of quiet that means something has shifted. Colonel Fortin filed a formal inquiry, he said. Into the hospital? Into the conduct of Greystone Regional Administration during the site visit. He wants to know why a patient in active resuscitation was ordered to be moved. He wants to know who gave the order. He wants to know what the protocol was. A pause. He also wants to know which nurse was on shift. She said nothing for a moment. He filed it the day after the visit, Kowalski said. Before we even got your documentation. She looked out her kitchen window at the snow coming down in the flat, steady way it does in February in eastern Ontario, and she thought about Colonel Fortin's lapel pin and about the way she hadn't looked up when Bear walked in, and about the patient's rhythm on the monitor at 7:22 a.m., and she felt something she hadn't felt in the 2.5 weeks since her suspension. Not vindication, not anger, something quieter than either of those. Something that felt like the ground coming back under her feet. The formal inquiry took 6 weeks. Hazel was interviewed twice, once by a provincial health oversight officer named Tran, and once by a representative from the DND liaison office whose name she was never given, but who took notes in a green-covered binder and asked questions with the particular precision of someone who already knew the answers and was simply confirming them. She was asked to reconstruct the events of the morning of February 9th. She did this twice with the same level of detail both times. Because her notes had been thorough, the times matched, the sequence matched. The exact language Barr had used, "I'll accept that clinical outcome," was in her written record, and she recited it from memory without hesitation. The investigator with the green binder looked up when she said that. She kept talking. She described the committee members in the corridor, the clipboard, the way Bear had looked through the glass at them while speaking to her, checking their reactions, managing something she could only describe as optics, the presentation of a clean, empty emergency bay at the moment of maximum visibility. She described Dr. Simard's face. She described the rhythm on the monitor. She described the drive home. Clifton Barr resigned from his position as Regional Director of Operations on a Tuesday in April. The resignation letter, released under access to information provision, cited personal reasons. The board accepted it without a public statement. 3 members of the site review committee filed written complaints against Greystone Health Network, citing misrepresentation of facility conditions during an official federal evaluation. 2 of those complaints were from provincial reviewers. One was from Colonel Fortin. The D&D Memorandum of Understanding was placed under conditional review, pending an independent audit of clinical operations. The union grievance was resolved in Hazel's favor the following week. Full reinstatement, back pay, formal apology in writing on hospital letterhead, signed by the interim board chair. She read the letter once. It was thorough. It used a great many words. She folded it and put it in the same folder as her original notes. The interim administrator called her on a Friday afternoon in late April. A woman named Thibodeau, whose first name was Anne, who had spent 20 years in nursing before moving into administration, and who spoke to Hazel the way people speak when they are trying to do a thing correctly and are genuinely unsure if they are succeeding. The board has asked me to offer you a seat on the Clinical Governance Advisory Panel, Thibodeau said. It's a new body. We're building it in response to the inquiry. The mandate is to ensure that clinical decisions are structurally protected from administrative override during active patient care. Hazel stood at her kitchen window. The snow was gone. The trees at the back of her building were starting to show new leaves, that particular yellow-green of early spring in Ontario that doesn't look like anything else. What does the panel have actual authority to do? She asked. Thibodeau paused. Then, that's exactly the right question. They talked for 40 minutes. Hazel took notes. She asked about reporting structure, about voting composition, about whether the panel's recommendations were binding or advisory. She asked whether frontline nurses would have representation or whether the body would default to physician and administration majority. She asked about the timeline for the independent audit. Thibodeau answered every question. Some answers were good. Some were incomplete. Hazel noted both. At the end of the call, she said, "I'll need the terms of reference in writing before I give you an answer." "Of course," Thibodeau said. "And I need a week." "Of course." Hazel set her phone down on the table. She made a fresh cup of tea. She thought about the patient in Bay 3 whose name she hadn't known on the morning of February 9th, and about the fact that his heart had been still for 7 minutes before it wasn't, and about the specific arithmetic of keeping compressions going when someone is telling you to stop. The math of continuing anyway, because the alternative is not abstract. It is right there in front of you in a person-shaped form, and his color is wrong and his pressure is dropping, and the count is at 14. She thought about what Thibodeau had described. A panel that had never existed before. A mandate that had come directly from a federal inquiry. A conversation that was happening because a retired soldier's heart had stopped in the right bay at the right moment, and a nurse had been counting. She thought about whether one person changing a structure was worth more than one person winning an argument. She thought yes. She thought, it is not even close. A week later, she called Thibodeau back and said she would take the seat with 3 conditions attached. She laid them out precisely, the same way she had reconstructed the events of February 9th, because precision was a form of care. Thibodeau agreed to 2 of them outright and took the 3rd back to the board. The board agreed to the 3rd on a Wednesday morning. Hazel found out by email. She read it at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she remembered to drink. Outside, the spring was finishing what it had started, and somewhere in a recovery ward at Greystone Regional, Sergeant Major Darnell Obie was learning to breathe on his own again, which is a thing the human body does on its own if you give it enough time, and enough oxygen, and someone willing to keep counting.